Welcome to our Black History Month Town Hall, where we will be talking about the history of policing and its ties with the institution of slavery. And we will also be expanding on ways to promote equity within policing and as civilians ourselves. So I'm a social justice intern for the Jacksonville Urban League Center of Advocacy and Social Justice. And we have two speakers. We have with us David Cunningham and Dr. Randy Nelson as well. And to start, we can just kind of go through questions with Dr. Nelson about the history of policing and its origins in slavery. He'll expand a little more, but Dr. David Cunningham is a professor and chair of sociology at Washington University in St. Louis. His research is focused on historical and contemporary systems of racialized control, and he is currently supported by the Mellon Foundation and National Institutes of Health. He has published books on FBI counterintelligence, as well as the rise and fall of the civil rights era with the Ku Klux Klan, which is really very relevant to what we will be talking about today. And he has most recently co-edited a special journal issue focused on the legacies of racialized violence in the US, while also building on past work with the Greensboro Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the Mississippi Truth Project, and the Reparative Justice Coalition of St. Louis. He is currently co-directing the Civil Rights and Restorative Justice Project Action Research Lab with collaborator Ward and 18 other WashU undergrads. And this lab investigates police and state involvement in 24 cases of racially motivated homicide in the 1930s and 1940s in Missouri, all in support of the reparative cold case work advanced by Northeastern Law School. So we're going to start by kind of expanding on the history. So the first question to start, Dr. Cunningham, would you be able to kind of discuss the history of slave codes and slave patrols and how they function to exert control over enslaved Black people during slavery and going into the Jim Crow era?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Caitlin. And I'm really pleased to be with you all this evening. Well, if we want to go back to thinking about the roots of policing as it relates to the slave codes, I think the first thing to understand, and this might be an obvious point, but just to say it, is that the slave codes were legal standards, but they clearly were not designed to regulate enslavers, people who owned enslaved people, or to establish any standards of treatment of enslaved people. So these were entirely codes that were designed as a set of laws and legal mechanisms to limit the movement and limit the behavior of enslaved people. And they really also tried to regulate and establish the obligations of free citizens to maintain enslavement. So these were all about kind of maintaining the order of the institution. And so these are modes of control, and they went along with what became the Black Codes after the Civil War, when enslavement was abolished, that served to restrict movement of people in Black populations. They would prohibit gatherings. They would prohibit the right to education. They would prohibit the right to commerce by enslaved people and then free Black people as well. And what seems important as we think about the roots of policing here is that the slave codes and the Black codes first provided a template for later legal structures that we think of as vagrancy laws. So these are laws with great discretion, where agents of the state could basically arrest and incarcerate people for almost anything, sort of being out in public space in any sort of way. And then certainly in a more fixed way, Jim Crow laws. So they established a template for these modes of legal control that we can see following the Civil War and then following with Jim Crow, the Reconstruction period, so moving into the late 19th century. So, the slave codes really became this mode of control that kind of laid the foundation for all these other legal controls that we see. And the other thing I might say about it as a starting point is that they also established a template that was later adopted by the police. And this is less talked about, but I think it's important that it established a mode of policing that focused on police as agents of the state, as agents of the government, but also as intersecting with citizenry, with white citizenry in this case. And so what we saw moving through Reconstruction and moving out of Reconstruction in the South are vigilantist militias that would really be doing the work that intersected directly with the police. And so we have merging of agents of the state, agents of the government, and citizens that were both seeing themselves as quote unquote maintaining order, which is really maintaining control in these particular ways. And, you know, I think the most widely known by far racist vigilante group of this era, and then moving into the 20th century, would be the Ku Klux Klan, which by the 1920s was thriving in all the states in the US. So this wasn't solely a Southern phenomenon. And there were KKK strongholds in Indiana and in Oregon and in New York State, throughout the Southwest. So this is clearly a national phenomenon. But it's really important when we think about police as public agents, as somehow connected to local and state governments, to also understand the ways in which they kind of intersected with more civil efforts to quote unquote maintain order, which really is tied up in our history of vigilantism, which again is tied up in our strong emphasis on the right to bear arms. And so citizens who can be armed, who can quote unquote stand their ground, can sort of defend their property and maintain order in that way. And so, you know, the first thing I'd say is that when we think about the slave codes, are just it lays this foundation both in terms of bringing a vigilante element into the government and thinking of that as a mode of policing, and also again for thinking about the form with which vagrancy laws and Jim Crow laws took shape in later decades.
Thank you for sharing that information. I think it really highlights the complex and intertwined issues of slavery and policing. And that was a really in-depth analysis as well. So we appreciate that. I guess moving on to, I feel like some of the Jim Crow era was reviewed, but do you have any additional information about the specifics of Black codes during the Jim Crow era and how they may have interrelated with laws with policing at the time?
Yeah, sure. I mean, another thing we can say about that era, I think as we move into the 20th century, this is often seen as the kind of time in which the foundation was laid for what people usually think of as modern policing. And one of the important things about that is that the architects of modern policing tended to develop their idea of what policing should look like through work they had previously done, which really focused on the regulation of enslavement. So when we think back to the slave codes, et cetera, the person most commonly thought of as creating literally the textbook for thinking about modern policing was British. And so typically we say, well, we imported models from policing from Britain, but actually this person, whose name was Patrick Calhoun, spent his formative years in colonial Virginia and learned what he thought of as his model for policing through that context. So he had strong interests in the cotton trade and also the sugar trade, which, as we know, had a strong basis and heavy reliance on enslaved labor, and controlling that labor force was really at the center of maintaining order in Calhoun's view. And so he goes to Britain and he writes the textbook on what policing should do, but his training again is really excuse me, is rooted in the regulation of enslavement. Sorry about this. Sorry. Okay, so when we think about Calhoun and these roots of modern policing, the other thing that we see is, again, like I echoed before, thinking into the Jim Crow era, we continue to see the intertwining of state and civil forces. So policing actually aren't thought of as only people who are hired by governments to police communities. And this goes back to the British system all the way back to the 14th century, where original conceptions of policing were really a combination of what people used to refer to as watchmen, who were citizens of a community, members of a community who would agree to basically keep watch. And they were augmented and supplemented by the original state police, who we think of as constables, going back in Britain in that way. And so you see this combination of citizens who are watchmen and people who are paid by governments to serve as constables. And then that model kind of builds out when we think about colonial US and then moving into the 19th century through conceptions of state militias. So militias who are bands of citizens who in effect have great discretion on how they might act to control order and maintain order in their communities. And so, the important part of this as we move into Jim Crow is that the ability to try to enforce Jim Crow laws are really rooted very directly back in policing models that hark back to the antebellum period prior to the Civil War, and really hark back to people who learned what policing could be through the ability of the slave codes and the Black codes to kind of restrict Black movement and to restrict the rights of both enslaved and free Black people. And so one of the things that we often think about is that we have some abstract legacy between the maintenance of order under enslavement and thinking about later Jim Crow periods, but they very directly relate to each other. It's not one of these things where you say, well, it just evolved in a way that didn't look much like the origins. The architects of Jim Crow policing really learned what they were doing through their work in the mid-19th century. And so there's a very direct connection between those two eras.
Thank you for that response. And I think it's really a reflection of how things are now, especially with a lot of movements, even like militia movements now that you see in the US. And kind of going off of that, the question I would have next for you was, like, in what ways can we see the influence of these laws on current modes of policing now?
Sure, yeah, and I appreciate how you mentioned kind of contemporary militia groups, because these are groups that in effect see themselves as militarized or police-like in some way, and they feel like they have the license to kind of operate alongside police. They assume that police are going to agree with them and are going to support them when they show up to protest in other places. And so, you're mentioning that seems like a really key connection to what we see today. And maybe a couple of other things that I would say is that first, especially when we think about Jim Crow era policing and its relationship to today, much of what we think of as Jim Crow, people tend to see this as a Southern phenomenon, a system of, legal apparatus to maintain racial segregation. But in many ways, we can think of Jim Crow as a national phenomenon. And this is the theme that I think is underemphasized oftentimes. But many of the ways in which a formal set of Jim Crow laws operated in the South were really mirrored in the North and in the West. And we see this very clearly in terms of how we see entrenched patterns of segregation in schools, entrenched patterns of residential segregation that are kind of propped up through policy. And so we see a lot of commonalities nationally. This is another thing that goes back to the slave codes, is all the way written into the Constitution. We have the Fugitive Slave Clause that was later formalized as law in the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850. But this created complicity across regions. So this was first a clause, a constitutional clause, then a legal stricture that mandated that if an enslaved person was in a free state, the police and other agents of the state, whether it be in New York or anywhere outside of the South, were required to capture and return those people to the South and to their owners. And so, all the way back to the Constitution, we see this complicity of the North in terms of maintaining the fidelity of enslavement. And so this is a theme that I think we need to kind of keep in mind in general when we think about how a lot of these trends have carried forward. And one is, it's really difficult to think of the South as an exceptional region in terms of racial disparities in policing and racial actions in policing. I think we see a lot of commonality across regions. And the other trends that I might just mention here now are something that we see in a very pronounced way over the last few decades, but really kind of hark back to at least the mid 20th century, are thinking about a militarization of policing. And when I say this, we can clearly, very viscerally see this in terms of weaponry and kind of a militarized presentation by police in terms of, body armor, the weapons that they would carry, the kind of training that they would have in that way. But, I think what we need to think about as well are the ways in which the connections of folks who have been running for decades now, police training programs, designing police training manuals, et cetera. There's been a very pronounced move that's almost a century long now to use military models in all of those aspects, not just in terms of the provision of weapons that look military grade, but also in the way that one trains police, the way that police are organized in terms of having different ranks and things like that. And also the recruitment of police. We see consistently going back to World War I, in fact, the kind of overemphasis on an overrepresentation of military veterans within the police. And so this militarization has been something that we can certainly see as kind of a carryover from these earlier eras. And maybe as a last thing, I would just say, one of the things that we see now, if we want to really try to trace these lines, and we might want to talk about these things in more depth as we move through, but beginning in the 1960s, we see this move away from social programs by the mid 1960s to providing more and more funding for police. So sort of diverting funds from social programs to law and order. That feeds in through the Nixon and Reagan eras in particular on the massive rise in incarceration rates that we've been subject to over the last few decades. And more recent criminological advances when we think about broken windows theory, when we think about stop and frisk, when we see things like stand your ground, that gives more what seems to be more latitude for citizens to commit violence in the name of defending themselves. All of these criminological moves have, the important thing about them is that they've increased the number of people who fall under the criminal legal system through incarceration or otherwise. But the important thing about that as well is that all of them are consistent with the logics that have created disparities in the racialized policing of Black bodies versus, and communities of color, the disproportionate policing there that we would see going all the way back to the early 19th century and the kind of legal strictures that were built up then. And so one of the things I would want to emphasize are the commonality in the logics that we see in terms of contemporary criminal legal systems and contemporary modes of policing to the logics that built up the racialized disparities in policing moving back to the 19th century.
Thank you so much. And I feel like that all the information really highlighted just the kind of foundational racialization in policing and how it contributes to so many issues, whether it's on a more social side or more militant side as well. So thank you for that amazing background on kind of the history of policing and the effects that it has on our current policing system, as well as the Black community and other minoritized communities. I wanted to open the floor for any attendees. If they had any questions for Dr. Cunningham, feel free to add it in the chat or also unmute and ask a question directly. I myself had a question. I was wondering, given the background, how can a better understanding of the history of these laws help us address current issues of systemic racism and policing and work towards creating a more equitable system?
Yeah, I mean, that's such an important question in so many ways. And, one of the things that, we might underscore more broadly, and this is not to push attention away from thinking about policing, in a very narrow and direct sense, but we think about equity. But to really think about the role that police have kind of vis-a-vis all these other social supports that we, claim to be providing within communities. I mean, one of the things we can talk about policing, and we can talk about the history of policing in terms of how that regulated and controlled communities of color in a variety of ways, in ways that we don't, differentially to what we would see in white communities. But clearly that's operating in lockstep and hand in hand with all of these other institutions in these communities, and the way in which the police are not just a body that kind of acts on communities, but they're given a mandate that really is supported politically, but also socially, and also economically. I mean, when we talk about this relationship to enslavement, I mean, one of the things that is a proxy for thinking about economic elites at the time as well, and police being established literally as a way to preserve order that maintains kind of an economic status quo. And, we can see this in terms of the control of labor in more industrial periods and things like this. And so, one of the things that I would say is that it's important when we think about reforming or otherwise transforming police to think about how that fits into not only the broader criminal legal system, but kind of these broader institutional bodies. I spend a lot of time looking at the South and the ways in which what we think of as kind of mundane daily operations within communities, politically and otherwise. When we think about, well, what are school boards doing? What are city councils doing? All of these kinds of things. You can see disparities within policing being very clearly mirrored by disparities that are kind of exacerbated through all these other bodies as well. And so, it points to, among other things, a more holistic look at policing alongside these other kinds of operations as well.
I definitely agree. And a reflection of just our policy, I feel like, or our policy reflects kind of the institutionalization of policing as a whole. We did have a question on the chat. Someone said, did I hear you say that there was more, that I guess the police is more militarized now and that there are higher incarceration rates?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I framed it as like a direct relationship or one causes the other, but I would definitely say that we see a relatively simultaneous increase in both of these things. So when we see the period within which both more resources and more direct connections to the military in terms of transferring equipment to local police forces and state police forces, that is kind of operating simultaneously to the pronounced growth of the criminal legal system in general, and in terms of institutions of incarceration in particular. And so I think that the move towards one of those things is kind of aligned with the move towards another. The thing that we can say that I think is important as well, it's not quite this question, but I think it's in parallel to it, is, and I think this is something that we're seeing right now, in periods where the police's autonomy and funding have been most pronouncedly challenged, tend to be followed by increased funding given to police. And so we're clearly in a moment over the last 2 to 3 years where there have been strong, this is a longstanding movement, but a very large movement to think about reforming the police, transforming the police. This can be abolition. There's a variety of ways to think about this. But when we look back at other periods where there were pronounced movements against, whether it be police brutality or the level of support that police receive, there tends to be a backlash where the police actually end up having increased funding in the periods immediately following. It's similar to gun control movements, where we see a lot of movements around creating gun control, and you look at what happens in the period after, you tend to see a loosening of any restrictions on guns afterwards. And so that backlash is really important and really insidious in these ways.
That's a really interesting phenomenon that I actually haven't thought about before. So thank you for that. Oh, sorry, someone has another question.
Just a point on what he was saying about the militarization of the police force. One thing you have to understand on one side is a lot of policemen have a military background.
Yeah.
They come from the military, or they're in the National Guard, or they're in the Army or Marine Reserve. So they have that experience already, which we've seen where you take military people and you put them on the border and everything goes wrong.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm not saying I'm not an advocate of the military. I'm just saying that when you mix the two, there could be some conflict. We put military, active duty, Guard, Reserve down there in Texas on the border, and it's always been a disaster. Now you take recruitment of military, you take recruitment of police officers, and you're at a job fair, you're looking for people with a military background for that structure and discipline. Now, to me, being a policeman and a military person is two separate. That's just my opinion. It's two separate. This isn't a combat zone.
Yeah.
This is a neighborhood. This is an urban neighborhood. Combatants don't negotiate that. They just point and shoot. So what you're talking about when you say militarization, they've recruited people that were in the military, have a military background.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I think that's exactly right. And I totally agree with you in terms of these should be sort of separate kinds of tracks, but there's been an increased blending of this, in part through personnel, in part through training, in part through the elevation of tactical units as really what is seen as kind of like the ultimate in terms of status within policing, is having tactical skills. One thing that we might point to, I'm always surprised doesn't get pointed to more often, but the most recent federal task force that has been convened on policing actually occurred after the police murder of Michael Brown in St. Louis, where I am now, in 2014. And so the task force is convened afterwards. And the major finding from that task force criticized police for having a training and a personnel mindset as what they refer to as warriors, rather than what they refer to as guardians. And they sort of developed these two policing tracks. So police as warriors and police as guardians. And I think, Alex, what you're speaking to as the kind of inappropriate overlaying of a military model onto police is very consistent with this warrior mentality and has become the dominant model of policing. And again, this task force really said there needs to be a move back to this other parallel model of policing that focuses on being guardians within a community. And I think it's really commensurate with what people refer now as having, mental health workers and social workers and things that are doing some of the work that police get called on to do now, even though they're mostly trained in a militaristic mindset. So I totally agree that that's, both a relatively recent phenomenon, but one that can be problematic in all the ways you mentioned.
Thank you for that. And then we have one last question before we move on to our next speaker for the sake of time. Alan asked, when referring to the police, do you mean exclusively local law enforcement agencies, or do you include state and federal agencies such as U.S. Marshals, the U.S. Marshals Service, FBI's, MPs, etc.?
Yeah, it's a great question, a really important one, and I think I'm doing this as well. I mean, people often just refer to the police as if it's a given category, and we kind of act like we all mutually understand it in the same way. And I think it's really important to kind of parse this out in this sense. I would say, though, that said, there are certain aspects, including many of the things that I was trying to highlight earlier, where we see a prevailing logic that actually kind of extends from the local level through the federal level. I spent a long time, like the earliest research that I did focused on the FBI specifically. And one of the things that you see when you look inside the FBI are the degree to which they are involved with training state and local police officers. So, they have training schools. They take in literally thousands of officers every year, come from local police forces and also come from state police forces, and take their training courses, et cetera. And so when we really think about the models that we're adopting with policing, a lot of them are top down in the sense that they're kind of crafted at the federal level. They're taught by federal agents, and it kind of trickles down into these more localized levels. So in that important way, I think we do see a lot of commonalities from the federal level to the state level to the local level.
Thank you so much for that response. And thank you for sharing your insights on everything that you have mentioned thus far. I feel like it really reflects the present day implications of slavery as an institution and policing as an institution as well. So I really appreciate your time here. So now we're going to move on to Dr. Randy B. Nelson, who is currently the director of Bethune-Cookman University Criminal Justice Administration Graduate Program and Center for Law and Social Justice in the College of Liberal Arts. He has a BA in Sociology from Eckerd College, an MA in Criminology from the University of South Florida, and a PhD in Criminology from Florida State University. Dr. Nelson's work focuses on developing and evaluating delinquency prevention strategies for disadvantaged communities. He has collaborated with nonprofit faith-based and community-based organizations to help them achieve their pragmatic and outcome goals. Moreover, Dr. Randy B. Nelson is an experienced law enforcement training consultant who specializes in community policing and engagement strategies. He coordinates the Florida Historically Black Colleges and University Law Enforcement Training and Recruitment Symposiums, and has worked with Florida Sheriff's Association and the Florida State Conference of the NAACP to host law enforcement and community engagement forums. Additionally, he has worked with the Florida Departments of Corrections and Juvenile Justice and served as an adjunct faculty member at Florida A&M University and Florida State University. So to begin our discussion, my first question is, how can we use our understanding of the historical and institutional roots of policing to develop strategies and initiatives that promote racial equity and justice in policing today? I think you are muted. Just wanted to check in.
There you go. Thank you, Caitlin, and glad to be here. Just my body of work speaks to, I agree with everything that David had to say relative to the history of policing. And there's nothing that I can nor should refute regarding the history of policing. But I do think that there's some things that are nuanced. And one of it is when we're looking at policing in the North versus policing in the South, just the sheer violence. I mean, not only by police, but if you look at lynchings in terms of where lynchings occurred and the violence, it mostly occurred in the South. Even today, if you look at law enforcement officers that are killed in the line of duty, that's reported by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the South every year in and year out, in terms of officers feloniously killed in the line of duty, the South leads the way. So I do think that there are a lot of similarities between the North and South relative to policing and other things, but the level of violence is unmatched in the South, and I think that's one. Secondly, policing, and this is now where I'm talking here now, policing isn't something you do to a community, it's something you do with. Where policing, whether it was the protection of slavery, whether it was the protection of wealth, that's factual. You can't deny that. But there's no institution in America Let's substitute policing with education, same thing. Let's substitute policing with any institution in America, same thing. So for me, when you're talking about systemic issues and racism, they've infected every institution in America. So why would police be any different? Today, I do believe that it is critically important for law enforcement professionals 24 or 25 years old that are coming into the profession, that they not only are taught what history, you know, the saying that if you don't know your history, you're doomed to repeat it. I think that that's a core of any police training, should be that. I know we're in a time now where people are saying critical race theory, or you don't want to offend. Truth is the truth, whether it's yesterday, today, or tomorrow, truth is still the truth. That should be a part of it, because whether you're white, black, green or yellow, Jew or Gentile, Republican or Democrat, we all deserve a safe and nurturing environment to raise our family. And I know you hear defund the police, all of it. I've traveled from doing police and community engagement from Bakersfield, California to Fort Lauderdale, Florida. I've never heard an individual that lives in a community where there's shooting and violence ever. I've never heard not one say anything about defunding the police. What I have heard them say is treat me fairly and equitable, just like you would anyone else. That's what I've heard. Secondly, I'm one to believe, and in the current environment, maybe in the minority, I don't think you can have a functioning democracy without law and order. Now, once again, you still have to be prefaced that with, it has to be, you treat me the same as you would the president of the United States. It has to be a fair and impartial policing, but I don't think that we can have a society in which that is the case, as long as we have all the other ills that are impacting our society and where people live, how they live, so on and so forth. So my work now at Bethune-Cookman University, in this environment right now, we have more students that are going into law enforcement profession now than ever before, even with the George Floyd, even with the Tyree. And it's because we're intentional and deliberate about, we can march, we can protest. It takes courageous leaderships to go into institutions that you know the history of those institutions and change. That's what I need. I can have these conversations about what policing is and what it isn't. But that's what we're doing at Bethune-Cookman University and the other 4 HBCUs here that we work with, producing the next generation of law enforcement professionals, not the officers, but the folk that are going to lead those agencies. And I think there's a direct correlation or parallel to that when you have a more diverse law enforcement profession. Now, I say that in the wake of Memphis, it was 5 Black police officers. That gets back to the core of what Dave was talking about, is the institution. So if the institution is the institution, then it doesn't matter the color of the officer. They're going to do what the institution does. But I don't think that that's every institution. So that whole broad track, all police are this, all agencies. There are some agencies that I wouldn't mind if my 14-year-old son said, I want to be a law enforcement in there. There are other agencies that I would say, I wouldn't want anyone working there. You need to tear it up from the roots and never, should it never be again. But Ferguson was a good example of that for me. Because Ferguson, the Mike Brown was a tragedy. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. There are police officers, black, white, green, and yellow, that'll say the actual decision to shoot at that particular, many of them would have done the same thing. What a lot of them say, I wouldn't have put myself. There are other things that could have been done, but the actual decision to shoot when there was that point, many of them said they would. The tragedy in Ferguson for me was the fact that we allowed a city manager and a government entity to tell law enforcement I want you to go out and raise revenue, and I want you to raise it on the backs of poor Black folk. That was a tragedy for me, that you took a profession that I think is the fine line between anarchy and chaos. It says you go out and not protect and serve, but you go out and get money off the back. So what do you think the most frequent violation in Ferguson was? If I were to ask, what would you think the most frequent violation in Ferguson was? Most people say speeding. Most people say running. It was jaywalking. Jaywalking. You get a $75 ticket for jaywalking. You don't pay it. Goes to $150. Goes. You had folk with thousands of dollars of fines that couldn't even pay their rent, and we were asking them to pay fines. So when law enforcement is used as a system to bring in revenue for a government, you lost it. That was the tragedy for me. And the other tragedy is that you didn't have a law enforcement professional or leader that was willing to stand up to that. So that's my conversation with young folk, is that at some point it comes a time, it's right and wrong, and where do you stand? The coward takes the easy way out and say, okay, this is what I need my job. So that's what I think law enforcement is in need of, some courageous leadership. And I've seen some. I wouldn't be here to say that there aren't some courageous leaders. David spoke to the 21st Century Policing Task Force. I think that was an excellent start. You look at the pillars, building trust and legitimacy was the first thing on the report. Building trust and legitimacy. Policing isn't something you do to a community, it's something you do with a community. The other thing that we speak to is the fact that if I were to ask you, how many, on average, how many American citizens, civilians, are killed by police each year? I get 4,000, I get 6,000, I get a large number. In actuality, it's about 1,000 a year. Of that 1,000, I asked, how many of you think are unarmed? They would say 50%, 60%. Well, it's less than 10%. But if you were to turn on your evening news or look at your news media, you would think that that's all that happened. The other thing, that when I'm in communities, they'll think that only Black males are killed by police. Not true, but Black males are 3.5 times more likely than white males. So there are more white males killed by police, but Black males are 3.5. It's not this or that, it's this and that. You have to be able to address this and that. We're in a time in society now where you choose a side. If I'm a Democrat, then I have to choose this side. If I'm a Republican, I have to choose this side. And I think when you get in a matter of it's defending the indefensible, whether you white, Black, green, or yellow, Republican, when you defend the indefensible, particularly for law enforcement, with unions and the like, when you defend the indefensible, how can I trust you? If you're willing to defend the indefensible, how can you build trust in the community? And by all regard, we must always hold police accountable. I'll march tomorrow. If law enforcement officer goes outside the due bounds, I will march tomorrow. And the next day, I'll still be trying to develop the next generation of law enforcement professionals. It's this and that, not this or that. And we have to be committed to it. The other thing is, as I said, I traveled the country. I went to Little Rock, Arkansas last year. The day before I got there, a 2-year-old and a 3-year-old was shot in a drive-by shooting. Orlando, Florida, a 14-year-old was shot on his grandmother's step. And we're right 2 blocks over, having a community and law enforcement action plan development. How can we strengthen the relationship and build community trust and safety? It can't be the conversation that Black lives only matter if a police officer takes. It can't be, because in reality, my 14-year-old and my 21-year-old are more likely to be killed by somebody other than a police officer. We still have to be able to have those conversations. So as an academician, they'll say, well, Randy, you can't have both of those conversations at the same time. Why can't I? See, and that's part of the problem. That's part of the problem. We only want to talk about the narrative that fits us. Now, as I said before, I have a 14-year-old and a 21-year-old that I love more than life itself. My 21-year-old said, Dad, I want to become a police officer. I would do everything in my power to dissuade him from doing so. He's a good kid. He's living in New York, living well, but life is about him. You know, I'll get to others when I have to about me. My 14-year-old has never seen a stranger. We go on vacation, he's like, I have to be like, hey, if I don't talk to him, you don't talk to him. That know them. That's what law enforcement needs now more than ever before. And when we're in a time and a place where not only society, but actions of law enforcement, bad officers, affect young, talented folk that would want to go into the profession, but because of that, they don't. It takes strength and courage to go in these professions. It does. Someone that's willing to run into a building when guns are shot, when things are being shot and others running out, there's a special place in heaven for someone to do that. You can't make that up. But once again, when you give someone a badge and a gun and the authority to take life and liberty in 2.2 seconds under the guise of the law, damn well, we have to hold them to a higher standard. And if they don't believe that, they shouldn't be in the profession, and we should do everything to get them out. But I can't lie. I'm not one to say that we need to get reform policing. Absolutely, I'm for reform. But I'm not the guy that says all police are bad, and that's not who I am. Who I am is that if you're going to wear that badge, we're going to hold you accountable. And if that accountability means you doing something to go to jail, damn right, you go to jail. But it also means if my 14-year-old son wants to get in that profession, I'm gonna look at him in his eyes and tell him that's a noble profession that he's willing to go do. Well, many others aren't. It has to be this and that. It can't be this or that. And we have to be intentional about it. Intentional about learning the history and not repeating it. Intentional about if policing is this and we want it to be that, who better to do it than us? I think HBCUs and others have a role and responsibility of doing that. Because you go to Chicago, you go to the Philadelphia, you go to many of those cities and look at the level of violence. Look at who's dying on the streets every day. We have to have those conversations. So while I recognize the institution of policing, I also recognize the institution of education. I also recognize the institutions of family, what family used to be and what they are. I recognize all those things, all part and parcel to this conversation. So as for our conversation here tonight regarding policing, the history of policing, and where do we go from here? We go where we're all committed to go. We can't, policing isn't something just like education that we hand to someone else and we sit by as idle spectators. That's what this has to be. It has to be a holding folk accountable where it needs to be and commending them when they deserve to be. That's policing, that's education, because there are two, and I'll close it with this. There are two professions that I give zero to little room for error. That's teachers, because bad teachers at an early age can steal dreams, and sometimes that's just as deadly as a gun. And police, because we give them the authority to take life or liberty under the guise of the law. Those two professions, pay them what they deserve and respect them. And on the flip side of that, when they go outside the due bounds, whether it's a teacher or law enforcement professional, you have to set a standard and a role that this is unacceptable for these professions. And when we don't do that, it gets to the credibility and the trust that we have in both of those institutions institutions of law and institutions of the education system. So that's my spiel, that's my take. But as I said before, I don't know how much time I have left on this earth, but you best believe all of it will be spent on these conversations, both in jeans and tennis shoes in urban communities, as well as in rural areas. These conversations must occur, and not only the conversation, but the work that needs to be done to make it happen.
Thank you for that response. I think it truly encompassed kind of, as you mentioned before, the holistic issues, not just this being a problem within the institution of policing, but different pillars of institutions and all over, and how we even see it, violence committed within our own communities that are not committed by police officers, it being a problem within specific neighborhoods or communities. But thank you for that response. And I guess if you have any additional information you wanted to add about the social, psychological, or political impacts of what we have spoken about so far, and specifically on Black communities or other minoritized communities today.
And that's a whole nother town hall, because because it impacts all of them. From the social, they were just showing a study, released a study maybe a couple of weeks ago, that you can see on MRIs the stress, the systems, and their impact on Black and brown kids at a young age. I can believe that. You put pressure and stress on anybody, you're going to see it. So that didn't surprise me. And politically, man, we're at a time now that if you're a Republican, the police can do no wrong. If you're a Democrat, we need to defund them. So that neither of those positions, extreme positions that I would say, would lend itself to getting to where President Obama's task force was going in terms of the pillars and what policing needs to be and reimagine. None of those get to that. On one end, there's nothing wrong. It's doing what it's supposed to. On the other end, we don't need police at all. So you have those two diametrically opposite positions, and that's our politics today. So and with me, when I'm going around the country training law enforcement, I'll tell them and I'll look them in the face, because there are sometimes I'm the only Black guy in the room and I'm the trainer. If you only look at Fox and that's it. If you only look at CNN and that's it. If you only look at, those are the news channels that I watch, and that's what I watch everything. I watch Fox just as much as I watch CNN, because you can't help a people unless you know a piece of people. And as law enforcement professional, it's not that you're going to only get called by Republicans or Democrats, Fox News, or you get called by everybody. And the fact that you actually go, you're willing to put your life on the line for any and everybody. So if you're tunnel vision and the only thing you see is Fox, if the only thing you see is MSNBC and you don't see the bigger picture, then you can't help a people. You're in the wrong profession. Not that you have to agree with the ideology, but once again, you can't help people unless you know them. You don't have to agree with them, but in order for you to help, because they don't call you for birthday parties and permissions. Folk call you when they need help. And that help is dependent on that you can bring some relief to them. But if this is all you know, there isn't much relief, and there's nothing that I think you can do as an effective law enforcement professional without having a wide lens. And all of us do. I mean, when we talk about bias and unconscious, I would be lying to everyone on this call if I told you in law enforcement as a parole officer years ago. But I would be lying to you if I told you that I were to pull over a white male with a swastika and a Confederate. I would be lying to you if I told you I didn't have a perception of who I think that individual was. Or if I'm in South St. Petersburg and I pulled over a Black male with a gold grill and saggy pants and all, I would be lying to you. But as a law enforcement professional, it would be my responsibility and duty to treat them like I would treat my mother, unless and until their actions dictate otherwise. So the fact that the hair stand up on, all of those things are fine, we're human. but it's the action. It's your action. And that's where training is. Training recognizes that we all have unconscious bias. And some of them are conscious. But either way, the job of a law enforcement professional says that you have to put that in the back burner. And that cannot be acted upon. And if so, you need to find another profession.
Definitely agree. And I also like how you mentioned kind of the aspect of polarization, especially in our political climate now. And I feel like the consumption of media that only feeds into your own views just digs a deeper hole where people are only, I guess, taking in from information that they are biased to. And it's refreshing to hear that you take the time to diversify what you're looking at and consuming, because it's really important and impactful, especially when you're engaging in conversations with other people who may or may not be like-minded. Thank you so much for that. As far as questions, if any attendees would like to drop a question in the chat or unmute themselves and ask, we would love to hear from you all. If not, I do have a question that I will wait a couple seconds to ask. With that, we do have a comment in the chat that stated, Dr. Nelson, I appreciate your work and your ability to maintain a neutral position while engaging very uncomfortable conversations with community stakeholders and LEO. I'm not sure what that stands for. I have had the opportunity to witness this in Florida on a few occasions, and it's been a learning experience. And I think that's reflective of the entire conversation thus far. A quick question I did have was, how can individual,
No, for me, neutral is that you're gonna take, for me, right is right and wrong is wrong. So you'll never see me go out and bash anybody or anything unless they deserve it. So you'll never see me bash all of policing. I'll talk about a bad police officer, a bad police agency. Absolutely, you speak truth to power. But I'll never, just like I'll never say all black males are bad. I'll never say that all white, I'll never do that. I'll always judge about their action, whether that's an institution, an individual, or an agency.
Thank you for your response. And we are at 8 o'clock right now. I did want to ask just one more question that I thought was really important. And I was wondering, as individuals, like all of us standing here today, and communities in general, what can we do to support efforts addressing systemic racism in policing or other types of institutions? And just generally, how can we work together to affect meaningful change?
David, question? Was that a David question?
I can repeat the question. This is for anyone to answer. So my question was, as individuals or the general community, what can we do to support efforts to address systemic racism in policing or other institutions? And just generally, how can we work together to create meaningful change?
David, I'll start off with quick. I think that we hark back to Dr. King. He said it was and this is paraphrasing, it wasn't the folk that were outright bigot and just saying the N-word and all, it was the silence of good people. So when we see things, whether it's in our political circle, whether it's in our social circle, or whether it's in our family, when we see things that are wrong and we don't stand for right, is on us. That's the way I see it. I think the silence of good people in the faces of wrong leads us to January 6th, leads us to Tyree Nichols, leads us to George Floyd. It's when we don't stand up for right, all of us suffer. So that's what I would say, that making sure that good people, good-hearted people stand up when it's time to stand up for wrong.
Yeah, I would wholeheartedly agree with that. I really appreciate that sentiment and all of your remarks here tonight. And the only thing I'd add, and I hope it's in the same spirit, in the same vein, is I think it's also important. We've been thinking holistically about policing, and I really appreciate the point about it's both this and that, rather this or that. Another dimension I might add to that is considering our own responsibilities as community residents in terms of our relationship to police, because there are instances when we attribute imbalances and disparities to the actions of police directly, but really the impetus for these things are coming from community residents who really kind of feel like they can draw on police in particular ways, or have an entitlement towards protection and public safety that isn't shared across neighborhoods. I mean, I live in St. Louis, which has had over a 10-year period the highest rate of fatal violence of anywhere in the country. And I live in an area, we have shot spotter technology here. So if there are any shots that are fired, it's picked up by these speakers, and so you can map out all of these shots. And within a half mile of my house, there are over 450 instances of documented shootings that have occurred over the last 7 years. But on the street that I live on, there are literally zero. And you see the ways in which different communities kind of make use of policing. I mean, there's private security in different neighborhoods. There are folks that are advocating for policing in non-equitable ways, which is really like, I want police to do this here, even though it can be sort of zero sum and it's taking resources away from other neighborhoods and all. So just to say, I feel like a lot of the policing conversation, rightly so, focuses on the actions of the police, but we should also focus on people's responsibility for how we conceive of policing and how we can have equitable communities that assumes that police are there to protect the public safety in general and not just in a narrow sense around our own interests in our own neighborhoods.
Thank you both for that response. I really appreciate that. And just because of time, we went a few minutes over. Thank you for everything. Thank you to our speakers and our attendees for joining us today and participating in this important conversation about the history of systemic racism and policing as an institution. And we hope that this conversation has shed light on the ways in which the legacy of slave codes, Black codes, and other discriminatory practices continue to shape the contemporary policing system today, and also perpetuate harms within our communities, but also our own communities perpetuating this harm as well. And I hope through these discussions and conversations that we can work towards a more just and equitable future, and that is the goal, where all members of our societies are treated with dignity and respect. And once again, thank you for everyone attending. Thank you for your insights, perspectives, and commitment to this work. And I really look forward to continuing this conversation in the future.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Good night.
Have a wonderful night. Bye-bye.